Our special guest today is Mark Tribe. I have abbreviated his bio, otherwise we'd spend the entire Zoom just talking about Mark's accomplishments. Tribe's work has been shown at numerous museums and galleries throughout the US and abroad, including Tasmania, Australia, Paris, Moscow, and Mexico City. Tribe has also received numerous grants and is the author of 2 books, the Port Huron Project, Reenactments of the New Left Protest Speeches by Charta in 2010, and New Media Art by Taschen in 2016, as well as numerous articles. His work has been reviewed and discussed in numerous publications such as Art Forum, Art America, Art News, the Boston Globe, Hyperallergic, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Village Voice, and many more. And just to get started, Mark, how are you? How have you and your family been faring in this time of COVID-19?
I'm well, thanks. We've been faring well. I live in Manhattan, and in mid-March, when things started to shut down, we all piled into the car and drove out to Bloomington, Indiana, to stay with my wife's parents, and spent most of the last 3 or 4 months there, and recently drove out with my daughters to stay with my sister in Los Angeles. So that's where I am right now, LA.
Okay, great, Mark. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make you a co-host.
Okay.
And hand this over to you.
Great. Just bear with me one moment while I cue this up. Okay. One moment. So Scott's asked me to speak for about half an hour on the project that I made, that the Schneider Museum, that I worked with the Schneider Museum on last summer. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the work leading up to it and some related work as well. I became interested in landscape in 2012 when I was working on a project that originally I didn't think had anything to do with landscape. I was filming militia training exercises. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the American militia movement, kind of grassroots, unorganized, unaffiliated quasi-network of patriotic groups, groups who are sometimes white supremacists, other times more libertarian. What they seem to have in common is an interest in preparing for a breakdown of law and order by dressing up, usually in camouflage, and firing military-style weapons, usually out in the woods. So I was filming a militia training exercise in upstate New York, and I found myself becoming increasingly interested in the land that they were training on, and thinking about what these locations had to do with the practice itself of paramilitary training and the paramilitary fantasies, behind those activities, which, for me as a artist coming from New York City, felt kind of strange and unusual. And I thought of them as a kind of, political performance in a way, and was thus thinking about, woodlands and other kinds of, wild landscapes as a stage or a screen on which they were performing or projecting their fantasies, whether they be fantasies of white supremacy or fantasies of maybe rewriting the laws of civil society, perhaps on more libertarian terms. as I was researching this project and looking for militia groups, I discovered that a lot of militia groups film or record using video cameras their training exercise and post them on YouTube. So as I'm researching on YouTube, I find, among other things, a very early film from 1997, from an earlier era in the militia movement. And I noticed striking similarities between the militia training films and films or videos that people would record when they were playing video games. So on the left, you see a still from a video that a militia posted in the late 90s. And on the right, a still from a video that someone posted of themselves playing what's known as a first-person shooter game. It's a kind of participatory video game in which you usually roam around a kind of world and engage in quasi-military exercises. The militia group I was recording also played a lot of first-person shooter games, and I started to think about the kind of collapse that's going on in contemporary culture between the virtual and the actual. Here's a comparison on the left, that same screen grab, and on the right, an image of a Hudson River School painting by Frederick Kensett. I was struck by how many of these first-person shooter games paid a lot of attention to the landscape and invested a lot of resources into creating these beautiful backdrops. And many of them seem to be inspired almost directly by 19th century landscape painting of the Hudson River School, and perhaps also German and French landscape painting from the same era. That led me to make a series of photographic prints based on pictures that I took while playing first-person shooter games. I'm not much of a gamer myself, but I learned about games, found the ones with the most interesting landscapes, and learned how to make really high-resolution screenshots while playing them, and then to enlarge them using special software, not Photoshop, but something similar, and then print them and mount them and frame them and exhibit them in galleries, much the way one would a color landscape photograph. Looking at these images on a screen takes away some of their impact, and also dilutes or muddies the conceptual waters of the project, in that what makes this work, I think, is the recontextualization, the transformation of something that originates in virtual reality on a screen and bringing it into the real, and making it manifest on the wall of a gallery, so that when one looks at it, it appears to be somewhere between a photograph and a painting, and doesn't seem to be, a virtual space at all. Just by comparison, here's another Hudson River School painting. This is Asher Durand from 1867, and another one of my video game-based photographic prints. And I call them photographs, even though they're not made with a conventional film or even digital lens-based camera. The way I made them was by, exploring these video game worlds, and then either hacking the game or using screenshot features built into the game to basically capture the image on the screen. Feels to me a lot like the landscape photography that I do with a lens-based camera out in the real world. But in fact, it's not lens-based. So here's how the work looked when it was first exhibited. It's been shown in various galleries and museums since. And alongside this work, I also showed a series of films that I shot on the militia training ground of the landscape. Went back to the place that I showed you at the beginning, where the guys in the camouflage with the guns were romping around in the snow. This is a few weeks later. The snow has melted. And the way I made this is worth focusing on because it stuck with me. Basically taking a film camera, placing it on a tripod, pressing the record, and then letting it record in real time. So it functions somewhere between a photograph and a film. What we're seeing is actually a moving image, and we weren't watching it via Zoom, but we're seeing it perhaps on a really good screen in a gallery or projected on a wall. You would see subtle movements in the grasses in the foreground, the branches in the middle ground, occasionally a moth or an insect flies in front of the camera. So it's kind of like a durational real-time photograph, a photograph that moves in front of your eyes, but the camera itself doesn't move. So you'll see that this way of capturing landscape images appear later in my work. So I then received a commission by the Corcoran Gallery of Art, a museum that unfortunately closed due to financial problems. The year after I had the opportunity to show there. This is an image by Bierstadt, a German-American 19th century landscape painter. What interested me about this image, which was in the Corcoran Gallery, was the way it was composited. It was a synthesis of different locations and different views that Bierstadt had sketched while touring and traveling in the Rockies and the California Sierra. So you see a bear coming down to the edge of a pond next to some giant sequoia trees. That appears to be California. On the left, we have a waterfall beneath some really dramatic clouds, and then towering in the background, what might be the Grand Tetons. So it was a kind of synthesis or composite of various locations. Around the same time, photographers like Carlton Watkins were exploring the American West and beginning to record lens-based images of the incredible landscapes of the West. And both of these ways of representing North America in this time of westward expansion and extermination and displacement of indigenous people. A lot of these images are understood by art historians as symptoms or expressions of the ideology of manifest destiny, which you may remember from your high school American history courses. The idea that the continent was in some way a gift, a divine gift, a providential gift from God to European settlers to exploit and to commune, I think, with the divine. So this ideology could be seen as, imbuing these images in this way of seeing. Bierstadt and others did represent indigenous people, but they did so always in a way that idealized them as a kind of noble savage, or tended to, which was equally problematic. So the question I ask myself is, what way of seeing the land might express a contemporary ideology of American power, what one might think of as American empire, the idea that we're a kind of global security force, keeping the planet safe for American-style capitalism. Using drones, satellites, weapons, but in particular these machinic eyes in the sky that look down at the land from a kind of drone's eye view, so that we can then police it and control it with our military more effectively. What I made are a group of large photographic prints that appear to be satellite images, perhaps captured using something like Google Earth, and then composited together, combining various viewpoints, which then results in these unusual geometrical shapes. In fact, what they are again, screen grabs from a virtual world. In this case, there's a simulation of the Earth that's geographically accurate, but not actually based on photographs. So again, I was sort of interested in this blurring, this liminal space that's emerging between the real and the virtual, and how that seems also to express where we are in terms of how we see the world. Always kind of mediated by an increasingly digitalized set of technologies. Here you can see the scale of these images as they were exhibited first at the Corcoran Gallery and then elsewhere. The image in the background, in front of which those two viewers are standing, is about 9 feet across. What they are UV prints, ultraviolet jet prints on dye bond, which is a kind of aluminum plastic composite panel. Here's just another image showing you the approximate scale of these works and their materiality. So from there, I at this point done a couple of projects that were, you could think of them as a kind of critical landscape practice, looking critically at, for example, how landscape functions in right-wing military fantasies, or how it functions in relation to American military ideology. And then, tried to look at my own landscape ideology. How do I see nature? And how do I feel? And how do I think when I'm out in wild places that are so important to me? I started to think about the time we're in, climate change, and other kinds of changes that are accelerating the pace of change in the natural world, such that, I'm 53 years old, and I have 2 children who are, in their teenage years. By the time they grow up and have kids, many of the places that we think of when we, think about the natural world will be well on their way to either disappearing or changing beyond recognition due to changes in temperature, in precipitation, forest fires, invasive species, etc. So I started making more of these durational real-time landscape films that are somewhat photographic, and they're meant to be exhibited in museums, hopefully preserved by museums in their permanent collections, so that they can be seen by contemporary audiences as reminders of what we have to lose if climate change and other kinds of environmental destruction continue unabated, and also be preserved for the future, so that 100, 200, 300 years from now, or even further in the future, our descendants might be able to go to a museum and see and hear what these places were like when the world was on the brink. There still seems to be a remote chance that we may be able to pull back and slow the rate of climate change, but we've already passed a lot of tipping points. And so I think even the most optimistic scenarios are somewhat gloomy when it comes to preserving places like the Griffey Lake Nature Reserve in Monroe County, Indiana. The format that I finally adopted was to shoot for 24 hours using a very high resolution digital cinema camera, and to record from midnight to midnight. So I'm capturing a whole cycle, 24-hour cycle in the life of a wild place. This is my first successful 24-hour recording, which I made in the Catskill Mountains, not far actually from where Asher B. Durand and other Hudson River School painters were making their paintings back in the 19th century. So, watching this streaming via Zoom is a kind of impoverished experience. If you were to see this in a gallery or museum, hopefully, with a large wall projection or a really high quality, 4K television screen and really good sound, you might really get a sense of, in a mediated way, what it might be like to be in this place on October 15th, 2016. So the project that I made most recently, that I shot last summer with support from Scott Malvern and the Schneider Museum, also the Friends of the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, and others in and around Ashland, was another 24-hour film that I made in the Precious National Monument for the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the creation of the monument. So here I'm going to show you just a 1-minute clip from the film, which was shot on I'm sorry, the date here is wrong on the slide, July 17th, 2019. So just about a year ago. So we're viewing Pilot Rock in the background. And as the sun rises, fog is rolling in over a ridge that extends into the distance. I hope you can hear the birds chirping. It's really remarkable. It's probably hard to see on your computer screens, but you can see the fog gently and slowly rolling past the trees on that ridge in the distance. So in the exhibition that is now online, but was originally going to be in the museum, in addition to the film, we were hoping to show a group of photographs that I shot while shooting the film. So I'm just going to quickly show you those. This is early in the morning before the fog began to lift and we were able to see into the distance. There's a snag, a dead tree in the middle ground that really stands out with the fog here. It's got this split in the trunk that forms two horns, almost like, a Viking's helmet or something like that. And, after spending many more than 24 hours, looking in this direction, I felt like that snag, that dead tree, had become almost a character. We became friends of a kind. This is about the same time as the video I just showed you. Maybe around 7 in the morning. Towards midday, with the sun overhead, things look a lot flatter, and the color temperature is quite cold. It's constantly changing throughout the day. In the afternoon, the shadows got long and the light started to get warmer, and you started to see a kind of layering between the foreground, the middle ground, the background, and then the far distance, with these layers of ridges getting increasingly obfuscated by the low-lying mist, or I guess it's just really humidity in the air catching the light. This is just after sunset. And then the last image is a long exposure as the moon is rising, and you can still see some stars appearing in the sky. So just to finish up, in addition to the films and the photographs, I'm making paintings that are based on photographs that I shoot while scouting locations. So this is acrylic and ink on canvas. And it's a view a few miles from where I shot the film, where you can see Mount Shasta in the background. Sort of looking out into Northern California across the state border and looking at Shasta in the background. And this is very close to where I shot the film. And what we see is some late afternoon sun peeking through pine trees into a meadow that has a bunch of salsify, they look a little bit like dandelions, but they're much larger and sturdier. It's an indigenous plant called salsify. I actually think I'm going to wrap up there. I'll stop the screen share and I'm looking forward to talking with Scott and with you all.
Thanks, Mark. Does anybody have any questions? I see in the chat, there's one question going back to the militia trainings upstate New York. Are you able to share with us where upstate that was located?
They're in an area called the Southern Tier, which is between the Pennsylvania border and Rochester. About 5 hours from New York City.
The reason why I asked was because New York State has the Iroquois Confederacy, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony. There's some fascinating history.
Yes.
I grew up there. I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah, the group that I reached out to many militia groups around the country. This particular group was flying under the radar more than most because militia activity is banned in New York in a way that it's not in other states like, say, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Texas, where it's more widely permitted. And their politics were pretty different from a lot of the other groups. They were more on the libertarian end. They thought of themselves as being more inclusive. They did not think of themselves as racist, whether they were or not, I think is an open question. But they weren't they weren't typical militia men and women, and that was interesting to me. This project wasn't really meant to document or portray their motivations so much as to represent their activities, their behavior, not what they sort of said or why they said they did things, but what they actually did. Looking at it as a kind of political performance, as I said before. And then leaving it to the viewer to sort of interpret and decide what it meant and what the aesthetics of that activity were and what their significance was.
I have a couple of technical questions on two aspects of the work. First, on the dye bond pieces.
Yeah.
How are they backed to hang on the wall?
So they have aluminum braces on them. Some of them are multiple panels. So the braces also attach to one another in the back so that they are rigid. So like the biggest pieces are 2 panels.
Right.
And they then have cleats, which allow them to attach to the wall.
And then the second one being on the paintings on canvas.
Yeah.
What about what size are they?
They range in size from 15 by 17 inches on the smallest ones to currently the largest one I've completed is about 4 by 6 feet. Some of them are on canvas, but I lately have been painting on dye bond as well. And my process involves taking a photograph, removing the color so that it becomes a grayscale image in Photoshop, printing it as either an inkjet or a UV print on dye bond or on canvas, and then overpainting using lots and lots of glazes so that over the course of a few hundred hours, it becomes a color painting. I actually, if I can walk across my space here without disorienting you guys too much, I can show you one in progress right now.
Great.
All right, Scott?
Yeah, that's great, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see here. You can sort of see my setup as I approach. Let's see. Get the light on. Right, so this is a painting I'm working on right now. And you can see that much of it is still black and white. And then here I have a couple of color photographs that I've taped on to the surface. And in between, this is painted. And on this side here, this is all painted. This is the first of what'll be 3 or 4 passes. So I make my way across the surface and then sort of go back again to make it, richer. And by the time I'm done, there really, there's no more of this, black and white. The paint is quite rich and thick, and the colors are very vivid. It's still not, gestural or impasto. It's really hearkening back to the Renaissance glazing techniques that I learned when I was an undergrad, taking a Renaissance painting techniques class at RISD, where you do a black and white or grayscale, it's called grisaille, underpainting, and then gradually build up color. And I was thinking to myself, wow, it'd be really interesting to do that with an actual photograph, skipping the step of drawing out and painting out the photograph in black and white, which I could do. But I like the status of these paintings as being somewhere between painting and photography. I think that's a tendency in most of my work, to have this kind of betwixt and between status. The films are, films, but there's no camera movement, no editing. The video game photographs and those, large dye bond prints are, somewhere between photography and digital imaging. I somehow feel more comfortable when my work is on the threshold between categories or media or disciplines, rather than sort of squarely in the middle of one or the other. Mm-hmm. So the paintings, when they're done, look very conventional. They look a lot like some kind of photorealistic landscape painting. But in fact, there's something a little bit fishy about them, right?
Mark, just like the paintings, you're sharing the process there. Creating these 24-hour digital films, the planning, that process, you're quote unquote getting outside of the artist's studio, you're communicating and interfacing with various individuals. Can you share a little bit about that process? Sure.
One question I often get is, what's special about the locations? And what they have in common is that they're protected wild places that quickly or slowly are under threat. I mean, the Cascade Siskiyou, could burn this summer. There was a big fire a couple of years ago, as many of you know, stopped really just at the southern border. But when it burns, it's not going to go back the same. Species that are already stressed by increased temperatures and reduced precipitation, may not thrive, won't thrive in the same way. So it'll grow back different from the Cascade Siskiyou that you all enjoy hiking in now. The process, it sometimes now thankfully begins with an invitation to come check a place out and try to do a project. I do a fair amount of research on the history of the place. I'm interested in who's lived there and used the land before contact and settlement by European descendants, and also since. So, in the case of the Cascade Siskiyou, I reached out to members of the Grand Ronde Confederation and other tribes. That was challenging because I'm not from Oregon, and I didn't have time to really visit with people and build trust and build relationships. But I also got to know a woman who grew up ranching in what is now the National Monument, and she took me around and told me stories, and told me, oh yeah, well, in that ravine there used to be a lot of rattlesnakes and that kind of thing, and she ended up helping us out by horse packing our cameras and other equipment into the location. For this film, I had the better part of 2 weeks to scout, and just sort of roamed around mostly by myself in the backcountry, trying to find a place that I felt could sustain interest over a 24-hour period. There's a lot of practical considerations having to do with light and sound, and then it involves getting the gear and the crew to the location and setting it all up, and then it's a kind of an endurance test to shoot for 24 hours straight. It's not just pressing record and walking away. It's a pretty labor-intensive process that involves keeping batteries charged and swapping out storage drives and constantly adjusting focus and exposure, mostly exposure. Just making sure that everything goes right, because it's very hard to do a retake when you're shooting for 24 hours.
That's right. So currently, right now, there is no machine, so to speak, that you can just hit record and capture 24 hours, 4K digital.
I might be able to rig something like that up, but it wouldn't be such great quality. And I'm interested in, I'm trying to make it as, I don't know, the simple way to say it, just make it as good as I can. And I have certainly thought about, shortcuts that would make it easier. In fact, on this shoot, we had to reshoot. We had to shoot twice, because after the first 24 hours, after we had, all crashed, and then we went to look at it the next day, we realized that there was a loose connection, put simply, that degraded the quality of the image, and we had to suck it up, get a couple days of rest, go into town, recharge our batteries and all that, and then shoot again, which is heartbreaking and really, really hard.
Wow.
Yeah, it's I guess maybe that's part of it, though, that investment of time, of energy, of care, I hope translates in the final image, the final experience of the work.
Any other questions from anybody else viewing?
Well, just one more about, it was interesting to hear you talk about the Bierstadt compositing.
Mm-hmm.
And does that component enter into the way you're thinking about what it is you're doing at all?
It did, yeah. Well, it did in that project. I mentioned that because what I did for those plein air images was take multiple images from a particular position using the software, and then composite them together, which resulted in the dynamic shapes. Which
Gotcha.
you'll see, in photographs taken by, for example, the Hubble Space Telescope, or by surveillance satellites, or by drones. If they're not cropped, they often have these interesting jagged edges, which are a visual signature of the compositing process. There are different ways of compositing, but the one that doesn't distort the image so much, what it does is it kind of tiles them together in what they call a mosaic.
Right.
Which then, creates these, I thought, really interesting dynamic shapes, which, I'm a kind of closet minimalist, or formalist, I should say. And at the Corcoran Gallery, in addition to the amazing collection of 19th century American landscape painting, they also had Washington color school paintings by people like Kenneth Noland. I've always loved the large shaped canvases of Ellsworth Kelly, Noland, Stella, and others. And it kind of gave me an excuse, kind of conceptual motivation to make, these really big dynamic shaped panels instead of—
I thought you might mention Kelly.
the old rectangles, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yes, Jamie.
Another artist that started to come to mind as I was watching the videos was Andy Warhol and the Empire. And he was tied to his technology and his era, as we are in our present day moment, and how that's going to appear 5 to 10 years later if we're around.
That's a very insightful comment. I do think of these as structural films. And although, Warhol's films aren't talked about as structural films as much as, say, for example, Kenneth Frampton or Michael Snow's. Basically, you know, it's using film in a sort of different way, not so much, you know, to tell a story, but to really explore and, I don't know, leverage the limitations or structural features of the technology itself. So yeah, that kind of, you know, durational quality, you know, I love Empire, you know, and it's been in the back of my mind for a long time to do something, you know, fundamentally durational like that. And it just kind of, you know, came around and manifested at this point in my life. Empire, for those of you who don't know, is a film that Warhol shot on 16 millimeter from a window in, I don't know if it was, you know, his space or a friend's space, in which the camera's on its side and it shows the top of the Empire State Building, and it's shot for 7 or 8 hours from sunset to sunrise. So it shows the lights, you know, the sky getting dark, and then the lights in the Empire State Building, which is shown sideways. The lights come on, and then basically nothing happens except for, you know, the reel changes every 20 minutes or so, and the film stock changes, and you get these kind of glitches and flares. And then approximately 7 hours later, you know, the sun starts to rise and the lights go out and the sky lightens and then the film's over. Yeah, I think he was also interested in, you know, in boredom, right? And in, you know, like he has a film called Sleep, which just shows somebody sleeping. And I mean, I love that work. I do remember when I was a young artist living in Berlin, there was a Warhol retrospective and they screened some of those in a theater. Which was really different from seeing them in a gallery, because it gets you to sit there for a long time and allows you to sit there and really contemplate. And you know, the film becomes to some extent like a meditative experience, a mirror for what's happening in your own consciousness. As you know, the light from the screen, you know, penetrates your eyes, and then something happens back here between the ears that normally we're not quite so aware of.
Any other questions from anyone? Well, one more question, Mark. So on a both personal and professional level, what is next for you? You know, we are dealing with the pandemic, an uprising, schools, colleges. You are supposed to be teaching in New York City. You know, so both near and distant future, you know, what are your plans and what are you working on now?
Thanks for asking. You know, personally, we're driving back cross country to New York City, arriving in early August. Yeah, the idea of going back and teaching in person, which is currently the plan at School of Visual Arts, is daunting. I'm concerned, you know, about the safety of my staff and faculty and students. We'll see. The School of Visual Arts plans to be as open as the New York State government allows us to be. In terms of my own artwork, I'm continuing to paint. I hope to make at least one more 24-hour long landscape film, similar to the two that I've made so far. Maybe many more than that, I don't know. And I've become really interested in trails, walking trails, woodland trails, or wilderness trails, potentially as a kind of opportunity for not just landscape experience, but also a kind of artistic practice, trail making. I started volunteering in Indiana with the Hoosier Hikers Council, a group of people that gets together to build and maintain trails in southern Indiana. And I've always liked making and maintaining trails. I've done a fair amount of it in my life. And suddenly it occurred to me that could be a new direction for my artistic practice. I don't think trail making is really understood to be a discipline in its own right. I mean, it's when trails are made, usually it's just a group of volunteers or people who work for, say, the National Park Service or the Appalachian Mountain Club or something like that. Sometimes a landscape architect is brought in. There's like one book that just came out on trails, but I'm thinking about making trails, walking trails as a kind of artistic practice. But this is really pretty nascent. I'm not really quite sure, how and when that'll actually manifest, and whether or not I'll really try to frame it as an artistic practice per se. But that's where my imagination is going right now.
So I'll get started on another grant for that. Bring you out again.
Let's do it. I would love to. Yeah.
It really does. It's getting my imagination going. I think that's a great idea, Mark.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, it could tie in, you can see it as a social practice or kind of participatory art, but it, resonates very strongly with land art as well. And, also, it ties in with, I don't know if you all have heard of forest bathing, but it's this practice that emerged in Japan of mindful walking in woodlands. And I don't know, yeah, I think it's got some potential.
Sounds great. Well, if there are no other questions from anyone, then I would just like to say, Mark, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you and seeing this project come through. Thank you for participating in our exhibition, and I'm sure we will be in touch soon.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.